Good day, Brigade. This is Bahbi coming at you with our newest episode here. And, well, we're not going to talk about what happened the past week with the whole Mar-a-Lago and everything, and the whole needless attacking of the FBI and Department of Justice by a certain group of people, egged on by a particular individual I think we all know the name of at this point. Today, no. We're going to actually cover what we said we were going to last episode and discuss some of our proposed ideas for constitutional amendments. Now, we did do this before a little bit in the past, but we're going to dedicate like a whole proper episode to it so we can explain ourselves a little and why we feel like such things needed to be added. And, well, this whole thing started with the whole call of a constitutional convention by many political groups out there. Anywho, before we get into all that fun stuff, a random fact for you here. About 1 in 5,000 North Atlantic lobsters are born bright blue. Yeah. I mean, that's rather unusual, but at the same time, you know, lobsters gotta be some color. And as someone who actually works in meat and seafood, I can tell you, a lot of those lobsters are just brown. Like, a weird orangish brown. Anyways, let's get on with the show. Alright, before we get like 100% fully started here, we're gonna let you know right now our voice might sound a little bit hoarse and a little rough. But we had a rather interesting encounter with an individual, and ultimately it led to a rock being thrown at us. Don't worry, it wasn't politically motivated or anything like that. It was more of a dispute about a crosswalk and all that kind of thing. It's really neither here nor there. Do not worry about it. We're fine. Everyone's fine. So, where are we gonna start here? Well, there have been a lot of good constitutional amendments proposed in the past, many of which have been straight up rejected or flat out ignored. But this is one we feel A, definitely made it to its list, and B, needs to be formally added to the Constitution, more or less, rather than needs to be introduced as an amendment. And if you've got an idea of how constitutional amendments in the past have been rejected in the United States, you might have a vague idea of where we're going with this. But our first proposal for a constitutional amendment is that Congress shall pass no law or amendment to this Constitution that discriminates based on sex, race, sexual orientation, religion, creed, or gender. For those of you who may not be super certain, that's basically a simplified rewording of the Equal Rights Amendment that was proposed back in the 80s and 90s. Arguably got the requisite number of votes, even though there are some states that have supposedly rescinded that. But that's where it comes into being a very huge question of constitutionality. Is it actually possible to rescind your yay vote on an amendment? Now, there is some precedent to saying that yes, you can. And the example actually comes from the first proposed amendment to the Constitution, which would have apportioned a specific number of congressional seats to each state based on a mathematical problem. Or rather, a mathematical formula, not a mathematical problem. However, it does create a mathematical problem in of itself, because that amendment, had it been passed, would have made it so that the House of Representatives would have around 6,600 people, or 6,600 people. It'd be a lot, but oddly enough, it would probably be closer to a proportional representation than what exists now. But the reason we bring this up is, as we said, there is actual historical precedent for rescinding your vote on an amendment. And there have been a couple states that have rescinded their vote on this first proposed amendment. And that's actually kind of the reason why we don't have it. In fact, it was one of those amendments that almost became a thing. At the time, it was almost ratified by the requisite number of states until one state rescinded their vote. If we remember correctly, that would be Delaware. But as time grew and went on, this amendment sat on the table and eventually gathered dust and was long forgotten. There are still about 11 states that agree to it, though, as there were states that did pick up this amendment later on in life and did approve of it, even though it still hasn't officially reached its requisite number. However, based on how the original Constitution and the current law go, that amendment will be on the table until it's either passed or explicitly rejected. And being such an archaic piece of legislation, in order for it to be explicitly rejected, it would kind of have to go through the process of being approved by the states, which would, kind of have to remember that it exists in the first place. But circling on back to the Equal Rights Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment actually did, arguably, get to that 3/4 threshold it needed. In fact, it had it for a very brief moment. However, there were states that suddenly changed legislatures and rescinded their votes. And this is where it becomes a bit of a tricky situation. Because the question becomes, should Congress have reviewed it for constitutional approval when it reached its requisite number? Or were they right in waiting until those were rescinded? Now, it should be pretty clear to everyone at this point that waiting until it was rescinded was definitely a political move. So that way, it could be reasonably argued that no, they do not have to take a look at it because it hasn't reached the requisite number of states. However, the argument comes in, is Congress obligated to review amendments? And the answer is, maybe. I mean, it is true that it has to go through the amendment process. But nowhere in the Constitution does it say that a constitutional amendment proposal has to actually be actively taken up by Congress just because the states vote for it. And this is kind of where it gets a bit tricky. Because amending the Constitution in itself is a bit of a bitch. And if Congress can wait, then who's to say that any amendment has to be considered? And this is part of the reason why the second method, calling for a constitutional convention, is a thing. So, at our hypothetical constitutional convention, what is the second amendment we would propose? Well, the Second Amendment actually comes to us from another historic source, and probably one you were never going to think of. So, our second proposal is, the citizens of the state shall reserve the right to recall the respective representatives and senators by a 2/3 majority vote should they feel their interests are not being properly represented. Now you might be thinking, oh crap, we're going to face recall after recall after recall after recall. That's not true, however, and there's a reason for that, and that is why we added that 2/3 majority requirement. Because, yes, you can easily make the argument, and quite successfully make the argument, that a simple majority of people disapproving of a particular representative as soon as they get elected is entirely possible, and in fact, very likely. Which, yes, it very much is. But that's why we put the 2/3 requirement. Why? Because if a representative is reaching a point of approval of 33%, that's a problem. Clearly that representative is doing something wrong and is either looking solely in their own interests or is just doing what the people of that particular district do not want to be represented as. And if a representative is going against the interests of the people he's representing, is he truly a representative? The answer is no. And where did we find this source for an amendment? Well, We're going to start right now by saying that in spite of taking this particular idea from this particular constitution, we do not condone, approve, or even like the particular organization that created this idea. However, we do see the value in giving a national right to recall. And the source we get this from, and please sit down if you haven't already, is the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. Now keep in mind, we again do not condone, accept, or approve of any of these actions from that historical entity or the modern assholes trying to bring that entity back today. However, we cannot just sit here and deny the idea of a national right of recall being a good idea simply because someone we don't like came up with it. In fact, we had a very similar situation with a particular news story about Rand Paul this week and his calling for the repeal of the Espionage Act. Now you might be thinking, hold on. Isn't the Espionage Act a good thing? And it can be when used right and properly. And isn't exactly 100% written the way it is. So for those of you who may not know, the Espionage Act was established in 1917 at the behest of Woodrow Wilson convincing Congress to do so while joining World War I. Now, the reason stated is to ensure that the American loyalty and all that was there and all that. The problem came with a lot of the Espionage Act wasn't so much an anti-espionage measure as it was super hardcore censorship law. In fact, for the longest time, the Espionage Act was used most often to arrest and imprison anarchists, socialists, communists. Yeah, in fact, notable communists such as Emma Goldman were also put under that. However, it should be noted that the Espionage Act isn't solely targeted at the left wing either, as there are actual right-wing organizations that have come under fire from it. This we cannot deny. In fact, there have been a couple of potential churches, not actual churches, but quasi sort of pseudo-religious organizations who want to be a religion but are probably more along the lines of a cult. But they're not doing anything illegal or wrong. Not these groups, anyways. So, in spite of him doing it for a very, very immoral and very wrong reason, Rand Paul actually does kind of have a point in that the Espionage Act is clearly a political weapon for the president to use, or for any political figure to really use reasonably if they knew how. In fact, Joseph McCarthy with McCarthyism used it heavily. So as you can see, in spite of his intention being completely wrong, the idea in itself isn't inherently bad. Just like the intention behind having the right to recall your representatives and senators by a 2/3 majority vote may not have been through the best intent, and it could have very well been a means to try to control their legislature. But on the other hand, in a proper, stable, functioning democracy, it's actually a really good thing to have. And realistically, we should probably seriously consider this. So, what have we got for our next amendment proposal? Well, this one should probably make some people happy and infuriate others. And then when the presidency switches, then it'll make other people happy, and the people who were previously happy will be pissed. So, what are we proposing? Supreme Court of the United States Justices shall sit for a term no longer than 8 years, and must be registered as unaffiliated/independent for at least 12 years. Any justice currently past this 8-year mark must resign their position immediately. The selection of new justices requires all nationally registered political parties provide a list of justices that meet these requirements to the President of the United States, who then must select from these lists no fewer than 3 candidates, each from a different list. These candidates will then be sent to the Senate to be interviewed. Then the Senate shall vote, using consensus voting, on the individual who will be chosen for the Supreme Court vacancy. Now, this is a bit of a complicated one, and while some of you might like the term limits and some of you might hate it, and almost all of you are going to freaking hate the registered as unaffiliated or independent for 12-year requirement, and on top of all of this, we're actually going to have to define legally that national political parties are a thing within the Constitution. Fun fact, the Constitution was established well before political parties were. But it's not impossible. It would require a bit of reform and undoubtedly constitutional amendment, but it is entirely possible and we honestly think should be implemented. As of current, only 4 of the Supreme Court justices would be able to stay on. And I'm sure you know who those 4 are. The other 5 would have to get out. Now you might be wondering, well, wouldn't this just make them more politically biased? And to that we say, no, that is why we have the 12-year requirement. But then you might respond with, well, couldn't one from a member from each political party then just quit being a part of the political party but still be friendly with the political party for 12 years? And to this answer, we actually say, yes, that's entirely possible and almost to be expected. However, there's a reason we chose 12 years. 12 years is the equivalent of 3 general election cycles in the United States. With 3 cycles having passed, we often find that the political situation can change quite dramatically. In fact, did you know 3 terms ago we weren't even remotely discussing Trump being within the sphere of politics outside of as a fringe candidate? No. Most people probably aren't aware of that fact. But back then, Trump was a proud supporter of Mitt Romney. So much so that he insisted his jet be in the background of Mitt Romney. But that's neither here nor there, and the important note that we're making here is, in the course of 3 election cycles, i.e. 12 years, the situation can change so dramatically that the unaffiliated may not recognize their party as the same, or may entirely leave their party. It could be that they stick with their party, but 12 years gives plenty of time for things to shift, change, and move. When being outside the bubble, things change, shift, and move for you, and you'll have to be and you're kind of stuck with what you can do on your unaffiliated fringe. Now you might be wondering, why every nationally registered political party? And that's a matter of fairness. Too often we see the Supreme Court being used as a political tool, even though its intention was to not be a political tool for parties. In fact, as we go back to the idea that parties weren't considered beforehand because they didn't really exist, we find that the Founding Fathers would have never guessed at such a thing occurring. Sure, they wouldn't have doubted political factionalism, but they saw those things as more temporary and not like permanent fucking political homes like modern political parties are. So, it only makes sense that the Constitution should be updated and account for the political situation at hand, as it did when it was first drafted. And to do that, we're going to have to alter how the Supreme Court is chosen. Because right now, it's just a political game. The way we've set it out forces it that it can't be. And that anyone who tries to make it a political game will likely lose. And that is why we chose the consensus voting measure as well. Because the consensus voting measure gives a far better likelihood of choosing the most agreeable, best possible, ideally least biased candidate as the winner of the consensus vote will be the one that most people can be accepting of. And thus it only makes sense to do it this way. So, what is one more thing we might like to propose? This is where we get a bit radical with it, so bear with us. I know, the other stuff wasn't radical. Trust me, this one's gonna be a bit different. Another constitutional amendment, and the last one we're gonna propose for the show today, as we are starting around a little bit low on time, is that the requirement of a minimum age of voting shall henceforth be abolished. The right to vote is to be determined based on understanding of the issues at hand, regardless of viewpoint, and an awareness of the political landscape within the past 4 years. Now, this is a bit difficult to understand, and a bit difficult to execute, especially since there are a couple problems that the Constitution poses for us. Aside from it being a constitutional amendment that the minimum age of voting is 18, another thing to consider here is that the Constitution also makes it unconstitutional to have some form of test. So you might be wondering, how are you going to determine if the average person is aware and understands the issues? Well, unfortunately, that requires setting up something that might be almost impossible in today's political landscape. That would require setting up a nonpartisan committee. Hold on. Yeah, I know, we're already out of the fucking realm of reality here. How could we possibly get a nonpartisan committee in this day and age? It's possible. But this nonpartisan committee has to be on top of all this. They have to understand the issues, they have to be able to create these tests so that people can take these tests, and if they pass, which honestly, it really shouldn't be too hard. We're thinking like maybe 3 or 4 questions. Not a multiple choice or anything like that, but a short answer essay kind of thing. So, you know, better get your number 2 pencils out. But if you pass this test, you have gained your right to vote for the cycle. Will this apply to midterms? No, as long as you take your general election test and pass, you should be able to go through the midterms no problem. Each general election cycle, however, is going to require a new test. And that's what this nonpartisan organization is going to be for, is creating said test. Now, if one feels this test is biased or rejects a viewpoint or attacks a viewpoint or something like that, such things can be contested in court. We're not going to say they can't. In fact, this will actually lead to a new power for the Supreme Court in determining whether or not such things are whether or not the test itself is considered constitutional. Now, for the test to be constitutional, it does have to meet a few requirements. Those requirements being that it, A, has to be talking about actual issues at hand. The issues determined will be picked based on national polling, and whatever the top issues are on the national polls. Now, this nonpartisan organization will also have to be taking these polls, and it's also important that individuals respond to these polls so that the actual issues at hand are actually being addressed. It's gonna be a lot of work, and it would be very tough, and honestly, it's kind of the reason why it's one of those more out there ones, because it would require a mass expansion of a bureaucracy that already people aren't too happy with. And honestly, I get it. I wouldn't ask anybody to just put their faith into an institution that's quizzing their intelligence on something. That requires a lot of trust. But the more we step away from this, the more we ignore things like this, and the worse things get, the less likely we're able to sit down and be rational about these issues. And that's a huge problem. Because, as we've seen throughout the past week, when people can't sit down, be calm, and think rationally about what they're going to do or say, it can result in some very serious negative consequences. Like idiots trying to shoot up the FBI in Cincinnati, or dumbasses rushing a barricade at the Capitol and holding out a gun and then committing suicide. Not with the gun, oddly enough. Or, say, some major political figure decides, hey, let's start getting things as riotous as possible, and then the next day say, hey, why don't we take the temperature down a little bit? And if anything I can do to help would be helpful, please let me know. Well, you might want to start with shutting the fuck up, because that's clearly, you talking, not helping. But yeah, this is why we have to start sitting down and seeing where things went wrong and how we can rebuild this trust. Because without this trust in this establishment of trust, things are only going to get worse. So, before we go here, the brigade orders for these 2 weeks. Assuming you haven't already, get into an exercise program. Get into some exercise program that you know works for you. You're going to want to do a little bit of cardio, and you're going to want to do a little bit of strength, bare minimum. But you're also going to want to do things to help build up your endurance as well. Second thing, again, if you haven't already, get a first aid kit and start learning how to clean and dress basic wounds. It's not super difficult, and there are a lot of first aid classes and such out there who would be more than willing to help and teach with that. And our third thing, which is a new order, for those of you who have already been following the first 2 orders, is if you're starting to do great on your exercise program, bump it up. Bump it up by about 10-20%. So if you've been running 2 miles, start running 2.2 or 2.5. Sorry, we're kind of doing improvised math off the top of our head right now. If you're doing 100 push-ups, go for 120. If you're doing 100 sit-ups, or if you're doing 50 sit-ups, go for 60. In other words, push your current limit and see if you can go past it and sustain that. Anyways, that's it for us here. It's been great having a chat with y'all. We're not going to be back next week, but the week after with another episode for you. And have a great night and a pleasant tomorrow. Those who wish not to be tread on should mind where they step.